Okay, good evening, everybody. It is time to get on with the reading. We're on to chapter 4 of this book. There are only 5 chapters. Like a third of the book is just citations and bibliography. He really wants you to know where he got his information, which is awesome. Um, I'm not going to be reading that part of the book, of course. If you want to know where he got something, then I suggest you get the book. Check it out at the library. They still exist. Um, anyway, let's get into it. Chapter 4 is Knowledge Fallacies. For many social issues, the most important decision is who makes the decision. Both social justice advocates and their critics might agree that many consequential social decisions are best made by those who have the most relevant knowledge, but they have radically different assumptions as to who in fact has the most knowledge. That is partly because they have radically different concepts of what is defined as knowledge. Such differences of opinion as to what constitutes knowledge go back for centuries. Conflicting visions of knowledge. Wow, that came out of nowhere. Sorry. Um, conflicting visions of knowledge. Intellectuals' view of knowledge was satirized in a verse about 19th century British scholar Benjamin Jowett, master of Balliol College at Oxford University. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's a quote, kind of a poemish thing. My name is Benjamin Jowett, or Joet. If it's knowledge, I know it. I am the master of this college. What I don't know isn't knowledge. Okay. End quote. Many people do not regard all information as deserving to be called knowledge, or would not regard the possessors of some kinds of information as being knowledgeable as possessors of some other kinds of information. A carpenter may know how to build a fence, and a physicist may know that E equals mc squared, but even if neither of them knows what the other knows, many people would consider the physicist more knowledgeable, whether because his knowledge required more study or an intellect capable of mastering more complex information. Knowledge, however, does not exist in a simple hierarchy, with the kind of special knowledge taught in schools and colleges at the top and more mundane knowledge at the bottom. Some knowledge in either category is more consequential than other knowledge, and that varies with specific circumstances and the kinds of decisions to be made, rather than varying with the complexity or elegance of the knowledge itself. Consequential knowledge. As an example of consequential knowledge, knowledge affecting decisions with meaningful consequences in people's lives. The officers in charge of the Titanic, no doubt, had much complex knowledge about the intricacies of ships and navigation on the seas, but the most consequential knowledge on a particular night was the mundane knowledge of the location of particular icebergs, because collision with an iceberg is what damaged and sank the Titanic. Although mundane information and special kinds of information have both been called knowledge by some, they are not commensurable, but are very distinct. Moreover, the presumably higher knowledge does not automatically encompass the more mundane knowledge. Each can be consequential in particular circumstances. This means that the distribution of consequential knowledge in a given society can be very different, depending on what kind of knowledge is involved. As another example of the role of mundane but consequential knowledge, when people migrate from one country to another, they seldom migrate randomly from all parts of the country they leave, or settle randomly in all parts of the country they go to. Various kinds of mundane knowledge, information of a sort not taught in schools or colleges, can play major roles in the migration decisions of millions of human beings. Two provinces in mid-19th century Spain, containing just 6% of the Spanish population, supplied 67% of the Spanish immigrants to Argentina. Moreover, when these immigrants arrived in Argentina, they lived clustered together in particular neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. Similarly, during the last quarter of the 19th century, nearly 90% of the Italian immigrants to Australia came from an area in Italy containing just 10% of that country's population. Yet immigration to Australia remained substantial over the years from the same isolated places in Italy where most of these emigrants originated. By 1939, there were more people from some Italian villages living in Australia than remained behind in those same villages back in Italy. Immigrants in general tend to go to some very specific place in the destination country where people from their home country, people known to them personally and trusted, have already settled before. Such people can provide newcomers with very specific information about the particular places where these earlier immigrants live. This has been highly valuable knowledge about such basic things as where to get a job, find an affordable place to live, and numerous other mundane but consequential things in a new country with unknown people and many unknown things about the way of life in a society that is new to the immigrants. Where this kind of knowledge happened to be available to people in particular places in Spain or Italy, people from those particular places had high rates of immigration, while many other places in these same countries that lacked such personal connections could have very few people immigrating. Contrary to implicit assumptions of random behavior by some social theorists, people did not emigrate randomly from Spain in general to Argentina in general, or from Italy in general to Australia in general. It was much the same story with Germans immigrating to the United States. One study found some villages, quote, practically transplanted from Germany to rural Missouri, end quote. There was a similar pattern among German immigrants to urban places in America. Frankfort, Kentucky was founded by people from Frankfurt, Germany, and Grand Island, Nebraska was founded by Schleswig-Holsteiners. Of all the people who immigrated from China to the United States in more than half a century prior to World War I, 60% came from Tuashan, just one of 98 counties in one province in southern China. Such patterns have been the rule, not the exception, among other immigrants to other countries, including the Lebanese settling in Colombia and Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe settling in particular parts of New York's Lower East Side slum neighborhood. These patterns of very specific ties to very specific places, based on very specific mundane but consequential knowledge of particular people in those places, extended into the social life of immigrants after their arrival and settlement. Most of the marriages that took place in 19th century New York's Irish neighborhoods were marriages between people from the same county in Ireland. It was much the same story in the Australian city of Griffith. In the years from 1920 to 1933, 90% of the Italian men who had emigrated from Venice and gotten married in Australia married Italian women who had also emigrated from Venice. People sort themselves out based on very specific information. Such patterns have been so widely observed that they have been given a name: chain migration, for the chain of personal connections involved. This is consequential knowledge, valued for its practical applications rather than because of its intellectual challenge or elegance. It is a highly specific kind of knowledge about highly specific people and places. This kind of knowledge is unlikely to be known by surrogate decision makers such as economic central planners or policy experts who may have far more of the kinds of knowledge taught in schools and colleges. But no matter how much of this later kind of knowledge may be regarded as higher knowledge, it does not necessarily encompass, much less supersede, what is regarded as lower knowledge. How much knowledge there is in a given society and how it is distributed depends crucially on how knowledge is conceived and refined. When a social justice advocate like Professor John Rawls of Harvard referred to how society should arrange certain outcomes, he was clearly referring to collective decisions of a kind that a government makes using knowledge available to surrogate decision makers, more so than the kind of knowledge known and used by individuals in the population at large when making their own decisions about their own lives. As an old saying expressed it, quote, "A fool can put on his coat better than a wise man can do it for him," end quote. Whatever the desirability of the goals sought by social justice advocates, the feasibility of achieving those goals through surrogate decision makers depends on the distribution of relevant and consequential knowledge. It also depends on the nature, purpose, and reliability of the political process through which governments act. The history of many 20th century fervent crusades for idealistic goals is a painful record of how often the granting of great powers to governments in pursuit of those goals led instead to totalitarian dictatorships. The bitter theme of the revolution betrayed, quote unquote, goes back at least as far as the French Revolution in the 18th century. At the opposite pole from the position attributed to Benjamin Jowett, uh, 20th century Nobel Prize winning economist F.A. Hayek's conception of knowledge would encompass both the carpenter's information and the physicist's information, and extend far beyond both. This put him in direct opposition to various systems of surrogate decision-making in the 20th century, including the social justice vision. To Hayek, consequential knowledge included not only articulated information, but also unarticulated information, embodied in behavioral responses to known realities. Examples might include something as simple and consequential as putting warm clothing on children before taking them out in cold weather, or moving your car over to the side of the road when you hear the siren of an emergency vehicle wanting to pass. As Hayek put it, quote, "Not all knowledge in this sense is part of our intellect, nor is our intellect the whole of our knowledge. Our habits and skills, our emotional attitudes, our tools, and our institutions all are in this sense adaptations to past experience which has grown up by selective elimination of less suitable conduct. They are as much an indispensable foundation of successful action as is our conscious knowledge." End quote. This sweeping definition of knowledge radically changes how the distribution of knowledge is seen. Consequential knowledge, as conceived by Hayek, is far more widely spread among the population at large, often in individually unimpressive fragments that will have to be coordinated by people's individual interactions with each other in order to achieve mutual accommodations, as in economic market transactions, for example. Another economist, Leonard Read, pointed out that no individual possesses all the knowledge required to produce all the components of a simple, inexpensive lead pencil. Market transactions bring together from different parts of the world the graphite used for writing, the rubber for the eraser, the wood in which these things are embedded, and the metal band that holds the eraser on. No given individual is likely to know how to produce all these very different things, often originating in very different places and using very different technologies. Inexpensive pencils are produced through chains of information and cooperation in market transactions based on condensed but consequential knowledge, conveyed in the form of prices, which in turn are based on competition between a variety of producers of each component. A manufacturer brings all these components of the pencil together at a cost that consumers are willing to pay. The implications of all this for the social justice vision depend not only on the desirability of the goals of that vision, but also on the feasibility of using particular kinds of institutions through which such goals might be pursued. It is not enough to say, as Professor Rollins said, that society should arrange to produce certain outcomes somehow. The choices of institutional mechanisms matter not only from the standpoint of economic efficiency, but even more so for the sake of preserving the freedom of millions of people to make their own decisions about their own lives as they see fit, rather than have surrogate decision makers preempt their decisions in the name of noble sounding words such as social justice. The convenient vagueness of referring to society as a decision maker to arrange outcomes, as in Rawls' excuse me, Rawls' vision of social justice, was preceded by progressive era philosopher John Dewey's similarly vague reference to social control to replace chaotic and narrowly individualistic decisions in market economies. Those are both in quotes. Before that, back in the 18th century, there was Rousseau's vague general will, quote unquote, for making decisions for the sake of the common good, quote unquote. Very different conceptions of decision making processes reflect very different beliefs about the distribution of consequential knowledge. It is understandable that people with very different conceptions of knowledge and its distribution reach very different conclusions as to which kinds of institutions produce better or worse outcomes for human beings. Excuse me, I got a frog in my throat tonight. Opposite visions. Although F.A. Hayek was a landmark figure in the development of an understanding of the crucial role of the distribution of knowledge in determining which kinds of policies and institutions were likely to produce what kinds of results, there were others before him whose analyses had similar implications and others after him, notably Milton Friedman, who applied Hayek's analysis in their own work. An opposite vision of knowledge and its distribution has likewise had a very long pedigree behind its opposite conclusions, namely that consequential knowledge is concentrated in intellectually more advanced people. The question of what constitutes knowledge was among the things addressed in a two-column 1793 treatise entitled Enquiry Concerning Political Justice by William Godwin. Godwin's conception of knowledge was very much like that prevalent in today's writings on social justice. Indeed, the word political in the title of his book was used in a sense common to that time, referring to the polity or governmental structure of a society. The word was used in a similar sense at that time in the expression political economy, meaning what we call economics today. The economic analysis of a society or polity, as distinguished from economic analysis of decisions in a home, business, or other individual institution within a society or polity. To Godwin, explicitly articulated reason was the source of knowledge and understanding. In this way, just views of society, quote unquote, in the minds of, quote, the liberal, educated, and reflecting members, end quote, of society will enable them to be, quote, to the people, guides and instructors, end quote. Man, I can't get rid of this. Hold on just a second. Wow, I don't know what's the matter tonight. Um, it'll clear up eventually, I think. Here, the assumption of superior knowledge and understanding did not lead to casting an intellectual elite in the role of surrogate decision makers as part of a government, but as influencers of the public, who in turn were expected to influence the government. A similar role for the intellectual elite appeared later in the 19th century writings of John Stuart Mill. Although Mill saw the population at large as having more knowledge than the government, he also saw the population as needing the guidance of elite intellectuals. As he said in On Liberty, democracy can rise above mediocrity only where, quote, the sovereign many have let themselves be guided, which in their best times they always have done, by the counsels and influence of a more highly gifted and instructed one or few. End quote. Mill depicted these intellectual elites, the best and the wisest, quote unquote, and thinking minds, quote unquote, the most cultivated intellects in the country, quote unquote, those who have been in advance of society in thought and feeling, as the salt of the earth. Without them, human life would become a stagnant pool. All those were short quotes from different sources. He called on the universities to, quote, send forth into society a succession of minds, not the creatures of their age, but capable of being its improvers and regenators, end quote. Ironically, this presumed indispensability of intellectuals for human progress was asserted at a time and in a place, 19th century Britain, where an industrial revolution was taking place in Mill's own lifetime that would change whole patterns of life in many nations around the world. Moreover, this industrial revolution was led by men with practical experience in industry rather than intellectual or scientific education. Among Americans as well, even revolutionary industrial giants like Thomas Edison and Henry Ford had very little formal schooling, and the first airplane to lift off the ground with a human being on board was invented by two bicycle mechanics, the Wright brothers, who never finished high school. Nevertheless, Nevertheless, John Stuart Mill's vision of the indispensable role of intellectuals in human progress has been one shared by many intellectuals over the centuries. These have included intellectuals leading crusades for more economic equality based, ironically, on assumptions of their own superiority. Rousseau said in the 18th century that he considered it, quote, the best and most natural arrangement for the wisest to govern the multitude, end quote. Variations on this theme have marked such movements against economic inequality as Marxism, Fabian socialism, progressivism, and social justice activism. And it's very true that the so-called educated do think of themselves as superior. I mean, look at college kids today. When they're talking to somebody who hasn't got a degree, they really talk down to them. Very condescending and that superiority complex. Anyway, Rousseau, despite his emphasis on society being guided by the general will, left the interpretation of that will to elites. He likened the masses of the people to, quote, a stupid pusillanimous, I don't know that word, pusillanimous invalid, end quote. And it's spelled Pussillanimous. Pusillanimous is, I don't know. Others on the 18th century left, such as William Godwin and the Marquis de Condorcet, expressed similar concept for the similar contempt for the masses. In the 19th century, Karl Marx said, quote, the working class is revolutionary or it is nothing, end quote. In other words, millions of fellow human beings mattered only if they carried out the Marxian vision. Fabian socialist pioneer George Bernard Shaw regarded the working class as being among the detestable people who have no right to live. He added, quote, I should despair if I did not know that they will all die presently and that there is no need on earth why they should be replaced by people like themselves, end quote. Another one of those elites that doesn't realize how society actually runs. In our own times, prominent legal scholar Professor Ronald Dworkin of Oxford University declared that, quote, a more equal society is a better society even if its citizens prefer inequality, end quote. French feminist pioneer Simone de Beauvoir likewise said, quote, "No woman should be authorized to stay at home to raise her children. Society should be totally different. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will make that one." End quote. In a similar vein, consumer activist Ralph Nader said that, quote, "The consumer must be protected at times from his own indiscretion and vanity," end quote. We have already seen how similar attitudes led genetic determinists in the early 20th century to casually advocate imprisoning people who had committed no crime and denying them a normal life on the basis of unsubstantiated beliefs that were then in vogue in intellectual circles. Given the conception of knowledge prevalent among many elite intellectuals and the distribution of such knowledge implied by that conception, it is hardly surprising that they reach the kinds of conclusions that they do. Indeed, to make the opposite assumption, that one's own great achievements and competence are confined to a narrow band out of the vast spectrum of human concerns, could be a major impediment to promoting social crusades that preempt the decisions of others who are supposedly to be the beneficiaries of such crusades as the quest for social justice. F. A. Hayek regarded the assumptions of crusading intellectuals as the fatal conceit, the title of his book on the subject. Although he was a landmark figure in opposition to the presumed superiority of intellectuals as guides or surrogate decision makers for other people, he was not alone in his opposition to the idea of a presumed concentration of consequential knowledge in intellectual elites. Professor Milton Friedman, another Nobel Prize economist, noted how that honor can lead to assumptions of omnicompetence by both the public and the recipient. Quote, "It is a tribute to the worldwide repute of the Nobel Awards that the announcement of an award converts its recipient into an instant expert on all and sundry. Needless to say, the attention is flattering but also corrupting." End quote. Yet another Nobel laureate, Professor George J. Stigler, likewise observed, quote, "A full collection of public statements signed by laureates whose work gave them not even professional acquaintance with the problem addressed by the statement would be a very large and somewhat depressing collection." End quote. He referred to, quote, "Nobel laureates who issue stern ultimata. Is that the plural of ultimatum? Uh, Ultimata to the public on almost a monthly basis and sometimes on no other basis." End quote. Such presumptions and omnicompetence have by no means been confined to Nobel laureates. Professor Friedman found such beliefs common among prominent individuals and institutions promoting social crusades currently in vogue. Quote, "I talked to and argued with groups from academia, from the media, from the financial community, from the foundation world, from you name it. I was appalled at what I found. There was an unbelievable degree of intellectual homogeneity, of acceptance of a standard set of views complete with cliché answers to every objection, of smug self-satisfaction at belonging to an in-group." End quote. Boy, doesn't that sound familiar these days. It is unusual for what critics say about some people to be so similar to what those people say about themselves. In this case, how intellectual elites feel so superior to other people. This pattern goes back at least as far as the 18th century and is consistent with what John Maynard Keynes said in the 20th century about the intellectual circle to which he had belonged. Quote, "We entirely repudiated a personal liability on us to obey general rules. We complained where did I get complained? We claimed the right to judge every individual case on its merits, and the wisdom, experience, and self-control to do so successfully. Before heaven, we claimed to be our own judge in our own case." End quote. Although in his later years Keynes recognized some of the problems with that approach, he nevertheless said, quote, "Yet so far as I am concerned, it is too late to change," end quote. A biographer of Keynes, a fellow economist who was his contemporary, pointed out another aspect of Keynes' character that has long been characteristic of some other intellectual elites. Quote, "He held forth on a great range of topics, on some of which he was thoroughly expert, but on others of which he may have derived his views from the few pages of a book at which he had happened to glance. The air of authority was the same in both cases." End quote. Differences in assumptions about the distribution of consequential knowledge are more than incidental social curiosities. People seeking similar goals can reach radically different conclusions about the way to achieve those goals when they have radically different beliefs about the nature and distribution of the consequential knowledge required. In some cases, the goals themselves can seem possible or impossible, depending on what kind of knowledge distribution would be required to reach those goals. Facts and myths. Policies based on the social justice vision tend to assume not only a concentration of consequential knowledge in intellectual elites, but also a concentration of the causes of socioeconomic disparities in such other people as heads of business, educational, and other institutions. Accordingly, the social justice agenda tends to focus its attention on correcting institutional and societal defects by having government empower surrogate decision makers to rescue victims of various forms of mistreatment by taking many decisions out of other people's hands. This is included taking some decisions out of the hands of the supposed victims themselves and transferring those decisions to elite surrogates whose supposedly greater knowledge could better protect their interests. These preemptions of other people's decisions for their own good has ranged from decisions about employment and personal finance to decisions about housing and the values to be taught to their children. Advocacy of such preemptions was a prominent feature on the progressive era in early 20th century America and has continued on into the present. Employment issues. One of the prominent early progressives to call for elite preemptions of other people's decisions was Walter E. Weyl. I guess it's Whale, Weyl. Who graduated from college at age 19, went on to earn a PhD, and had a career as an academic and a journalist. He was clearly one of the intellectual elites, and he devoted his talents to crusading for a quote-unquote socialized democracy in which employees would be protected from the quote great interstate corporations end quote, among other hazards and restrictions. For example, quote, a law forbidding a woman to work in the textile mills at night is a law increasing rather than restricting her liberty, simply because it takes from the employer his former right to compel her through sheer economic pressure to work at night when she would prefer to work by day, end quote. Clearly, Walter E. Whale saw the employer as taking away this woman's liberty and people like himself as wanting to restore it to her, even though it was the employer who offered her an option and surrogates like Whale who wanted to take away her option. For intellectual elites who see society's consequential knowledge concentrated in people like themselves, this might make sense. But people who see consequential knowledge widely diffused among the population at large could reach the opposite conclusion already mentioned, that, quote, a fool can put on his coat better than a wise man can do it for him, end quote, or her. Minimum wage laws are another example of intellectual elites and social justice advocates acting as surrogate decision makers, preempting the decisions of both employers and employees. As noted in Chapter 3, the unemployment rate among black 16-year-old and 17-year-old males was under 10% in 1948, when inflation had rendered the minimum wage law ineffective. But after a series of minimum wage increases beginning in 1950, restored that uh, restored that law's effectiveness, the unemployment rate of black males in this age bracket rose and never fell below 20% for more than 3 consecutive decades in the years 1958 to 1994. In some of those years, their unemployment rate was over 40%. Moreover, during those years, the virtually identical unemployment rates for black and white teenage males that existed when the minimum wage law was ineffective in 1948 now had a racial gap. Black teenage male unemployment rates were now often twice as high as the unemployment rate for white teenage males. In 2009, ironically, the first year of the Obama administration, the annual unemployment rate of black teenage males as a whole was 52%. In other words, half of all black teenage males looking for jobs could not find any because surrogate decision makers made it illegal for them to take jobs at wages that employers were willing to pay, but which third-party surrogates disliked. Preempting their options left black teenage males the choice of doing without pay in legal occupations or making money from illegal activities such as selling drugs, an activity with dangers from both the law and rival gangs. But even if unemployed black teenage males just hung around idle on the streets, no community of any race is made better off with many adolescent males hanging around with nothing useful to do. None of these facts has made the slightest impression on many people advocating higher minimum wage rates. This is another example of situations in which friends and defenders of the less fortunate are oblivious to the harm they are doing. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, for example, depicted people who assume minimum wage laws as, I'm sorry, who oppose, I don't know where I got assume, who oppose minimum wage laws as people with hostility to raising the minimum wage to keep up with inflation, quote unquote, because of their mean-spiritedness or, quote, at least a lack of empathy toward those struggling, end quote. Wow. I'm going to have to sit up again here. There is no need to attribute malign intentions to Nicholas Kristof. Fact-free moralizing is a common pattern among social justice advocates. Fact-free moralizing, I love that. But the fundamental problem is an institutional problem when laws allow third-party surrogates to preempt other people's decisions and pay no price for being wrong, no matter how high the price paid by others whom they are supposedly helping. Ain't that the truth? Anyone seriously interested in facts about the effects of minimum wage laws on employment can find such facts in innumerable examples from countries around the world and in different periods of history. Most modern industrial countries have minimum wage laws, but some do not, so their unemployment levels can be compared to the unemployment levels in other countries. It was news in 2003 when The Economist magazine reported that Switzerland's unemployment rate, quote, neared a 5-year high of 3.9% in February, end quote. Switzerland had no minimum wage law. The city-state of Singapore has also been without a minimum wage law, and its unemployment rate has been as low as 2.1% in 2013. Back in 1991, when Hong Kong was still a British colony, it too had no minimum wage law, and its unemployment rate was under 2%. The last American administration without a national minimum wage law was the Coolidge administration in the 1920s. In President Coolidge's last 4 years in office, the annual unemployment rate ranged from a high of 4.2% to a low of 1.8%. While some social justice advocates may think of minimum wage laws as a way to help low income people, many special interest groups in countries around the world, perhaps more experienced and informed about their own economic interests, have deliberately advocated minimum wage laws for the express purpose of pricing some low income people out of the labor market. At one time, the groups targeted for exclusion included Japanese immigrant workers in Canada and African workers in South Africa under apartheid, among others. Payday loans. Similar presumptions have led to many local social justice crusades to outlaw so called payday loans in low income neighborhoods. These are usually short term loans of small amounts of money, charging something like $15 per $100 lent for perhaps a few weeks. Low income people facing some unexpected financial emergency often turn to such loans because banks are unlikely to lend to them, and the money they need to deal with some emergency must be paid before their next check is due, whether that is a paycheck from some job or a check from welfare or some other source. Perhaps an old car has broken down and needs immediate repairs, if that is the only way someone can get to work from where they live. Or a family member might have suddenly gotten sick and needs some expensive medicine right away. In any event, the borrowers need money they don't have and they need it right now. Paying $15 to borrow $100 until the end of the month may be one of the very few options available. But that could work out mathematically to an annual interest rate of several 100%, and social justice advocates consider that exploitation. Accordingly, payday loans have been denounced from the editorial pages of the New York Times to many other venues for social justice activism. Okay, we're just coming up on the halfway mark. By the same kind of reasoning as that denouncing payday loan interest rates as being several 100% on an annual basis, renting a hotel room for $100 a night is paying $36,500 rent annually, which seems exorbitant for renting a room. But of course, most people are very unlikely to rent a hotel room for a year at that price. Nor is there any guarantee that to the hotel management that every room in a hotel will be rented every night, even though hotel employees have to be paid every payday, regardless of how many rooms are rented or not rented. Nevertheless, based on reasoning about annual interest rates, some states have imposed interest rate caps, which have often been enough to shut down most payday loan businesses. Among the other flaws in the social justice crusaders' reasoning is that the $15 is not all interest, as economists define interest. That sum also covers the cost of processing the loan and covers the inevitable risk of losses from any kind of lending, as well as covering such common business expenses as employees' salaries, rent, etc., that other businesses have. Such costs are a higher percentage of all costs within a small amount when a small amount of money is borrowed. It does not cost a bank 100 times as much to process a loan of $10,000 as it costs a payday loan business to process a loan of $100. In short, the real interest rate, net of other costs, is unlikely to be anything resembling the alarming interest rate numbers that are thrown around recklessly in order to justify preempting the decisions of low income people faced with a financial emergency. But nevertheless, intellectual elites and social justice crusaders can go away feeling good about themselves after depriving poor people of one of their very few options for dealing with a financial emergency. To someone directly involved, it may be worth much more than $15 to avoid losing a day's pay or to spare a sick family member needless suffering, but it may never occur to crusading intellectual elites that ordinary people may have far more consequential knowledge about their own circumstances than distant surrogates have. As for exploitation, it is not always easy to know what some people mean specifically when they use that word, other than as an expression of their disapproval. But if we take exploitation in this context to mean that people who own payday loan businesses receive a higher rate of return on their business investment than is necessary to compensate them for being in this particular business, then the complete shutdown of many payday loan businesses in the wake of legislation reducing their interest charges suggests the opposite. Why would anyone completely give up a business that still earns them as much of a return on their investment as other businesses receive? In the particular cases where legislated limits on what is called interest force payday loan businesses to go out of business, social justice reformers may go away feeling good about having ended exploitation of the poor when they have, in fact, simply denied the poor one of their very few options in an emergency by preventing the businesses supplying that option from earning a rate of return common in other businesses. Vesper, hey, how's it going? We're about halfway through the chapter here. I'm glad you could stop in. Let's see, how long have we been going? 48 minutes. I'm halfway through. There's 30 pages and I've read 16. So this is the 4th chapter out of 5 chapters in this book. So we're nearing the end. And I am out of water, and I am going to need more before I can get through this chapter. So if you will excuse me for just a minute, I am going to go just refill my glass, and I will be right back. Okay, I am back. Your last question, what is the chapter about? So far, it's been mainly about, what did he call it? Consequential knowledge, and what that means, and which it means different things to different people. Like consequential knowledge of how to change the oil in your car is consequential knowledge, but so is, you know, knowing how to invest in the stock market, but they're two totally different things and people value them differently. And then he's gotten into intellectual elites and wanting to be the ones that make decisions for the people they consider lesser, less intellectual, less knowledgeable, whatever. So, yeah. Um, all right. So, moving on. Housing decisions. Even such basic individual decisions as where to live, in what kind of housing, and in what kind of neighborhood have been preempted by surrogate decision makers. That's those elites, the surrogate decision makers. People like politicians that know jack shit about what they're legislating on. Something I firmly believe. Not all knowledge is wisdom. That is very true. For more than a century, social reformers have used the power of government to force low-income people to abandon the homes in which they have chosen to live and move to places the reformers consider better. Though these policies have gone by a variety of names, such as slum clearance, urban renewal, or whatever other names happen to be in vogue politically at various times. Some of the housing that the poorest people lived in, especially back in the early 20th century, was truly awful. A survey in 1908 showed that about half of the families who lived on New York's Lower East Side had 3 or 4 people sleeping per room, and nearly 25% of these families had 5 or more people sleeping per room. Individual home bathtubs were very rare in such places at that time. An indoor faucet or toilet to be shared by many tenants was a recent improvement, and they were by no means universal. There were still thousands of outdoor toilets in the backyards, which could be something of a challenge in the winter. Surrogate decision makers did not merely advise the tenants to leave, nor did the government provide places to which they could move. Instead, government officials ordered the slums torn down and used the police to evict tenants who did not want to leave. During these and later times, surrogate decision makers simply assumed that their own knowledge and understanding were superior to that of the low income people they had forced out of the tenements. Later, after better housing was built as replacements, the surrogates could feel vindicated. Or perhaps more accurately, not all information is knowledge. That's also true, and that's something he mentioned earlier in the chapter, just in the first couple of pages. Even if both the housing that the evicted tenants moved into immediately and the new housing that was built to replace the slums were better, the slum tenants already had the former option before they were evicted, and their choice when they had had one was to stay where they were in order to save some much needed money rather than pay higher rent. Often the better housing that was built as replacements was also more expensive. Among the poorest of the European immigrants in that time were Eastern European Jews. Their men, their men often began working as peddlers on the streets while the women and children worked at home for long hours at low piecework pay on consignments of clothing production in the slum apartments where they lived. They were often trying to save up enough money to be able to eventually open up some small shop or grocery store in hopes of being able to earn a better living that way, or at least not having their men be peddlers working outdoors on the streets in all kinds of weather. Many of these Jewish immigrants had family members back in Eastern Europe where they were being attacked by anti Semitic mobs. The money being saved was also used to pay the fares of those family members who desperately needed to escape. During these years, most of the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who came to America had their fares paid by family members already living in America, even though many Jews at that time were still poor and living in slums. Other immigrant groups living in slums in 19th century and early 20th century America had similarly urgent situations to deal with. Italian immigrants, who were overwhelmingly men, often had families back in the poorer southern regions of Italy, to whom they sent money they earned in the United States. These immigrants often slept many men to a room in order to save money. Observers who noticed that they seemed to be physically smaller than other men, something who not said of Italian men in America in later generations, may not have known that these men skimped even on food in order to save up money with which to either return to Italy in a few years to rejoin their families or to send money to their families to come join them in America. In an earlier generation, Irish immigrants lived in some of the worst slums in America, usually in families, but also with other family members still remaining in Ireland, where a crop failure created a devastating famine that struck in the 1840s. Like the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe in later years, the Irish living in America sent money back to their family members in Ireland so that they could immigrate to America with their fares prepaid. These and other urgent reasons for needing to save money were part of the consequential knowledge keenly felt by family members living in the slums, but less likely to be known by surrogate decision makers with great confidence in their own supposedly superior knowledge and understanding. Early progressive era writer Walter E. Whale said that, quote, a tenement house law increases the liberty of tenement dwellers, end quote. The resistance of slum dwellers who had to be forced out by police suggests that they saw things differently. Excuse me. Children. An even deeper penetration into the lives of other people has been preempting parents' roles in raising their own children. The decision as to when and how parents want their children to be informed and advised about sex was simply preempted by surrogates who introduced sex education into the public schools in the 1960s. Like so many other social crusades by intellectual elites, the sex education agenda was presented politically as an urgent response to an existing crisis. In this case, the problems to be solved were said to include unwanted pregnancies among teenage girls and venereal diseases among both sexes. A Planned Parenthood representative, for example, testified before a congressional committee on the need for such programs, quote, to assist our young people in reducing the incidence of out-of-wedlock births and early marriage necessitated by pregnancy, end quote. Similar views as regards both venereal diseases and unwanted pregnancies were echoed in many elite intellectual circles, and questioners or critics were depicted as ignorant or worse. What were the actual facts as of the time of this crisis, supposedly in urgent need of a solution by preempting the roles of parents? Venereal diseases had been declining for years. The rate of infection for gonorrhea declined every year from 1950 through 1958, and the rate of syphilis infection was by 1960 less than half of what it had been in 1950. The pregnancy rate among teenage girls had declined for more than a decade. As for the facts about what happened after sex education was widely introduced into public schools, the rate of teenage gonorrhea tripled between 1956 and 1975. The rate of infection from syphilis continued to decline, but its rate of decline from 1961 on was somewhere near as steep as its sharp rate of decline in earlier years. During the 1970s, the pregnancy rate among females from 15 years old to 19 years old rose from approximately 68 per thousand in 1970 to approximately 96 per thousand in 1980. Data from birth rates per thousand females in this same age group differ numerically because of abortions and miscarriages, but the pattern over the years was similar. Beginning in the years before sex education was introduced into the public schools on a large scale in the 1960s, the birth rate among unmarried females aged 15 to 19 was 12.6 per thousand in 1950, 15.3 in 1960, 22.4 in 1970, and 27.6 in 1980. At the end of the century in 1999, it was 40.4 per thousand. As a percentage of all births, as a percentage of all births to females in the same age bracket, both married and unmarried, the births to unmarried females in this age bracket was 13.4% of all the births to females of these ages in 1950. 14.8 in 1960, 29.5 in 1970, and 47.6 in 1980. As of the year 2000, more than three-quarters of all the births to females in this age bracket, 78.7%, were to unmarried females. The reason is not hard to find. The percentage of unmarried teenage females who had engaged in sex was higher at every age from 15 through 19 by 1976 than it was just 5 years earlier. Nor is it hard to understand why, when the specifics of what was called sex education included such things as this, quote, a popular sex instructional program for junior high school students aged 13 and 14 shows film strips of four naked couples, two homosexual and two heterosexual, performing a variety of sexually explicit acts, and teachers are warned with a cautionary note from the sex educators not to show the material to parents or friends. A quote within the quote, many of the materials of this program shown to people outside the context of the program itself can evoke misunderstanding and difficulties. And the end of both quotes. When some parents in Connecticut learned of the specifics of such sex education programs and protested, they were denounced as fundamentalists and right-wing extremists. It so happens that their religion is known even if their political views are not. They were affluent Episcopalians. But here, as with many other issues involving the social crusades of intellectual elites, arguments against their positions are too often answered by ad hominem denunciations rather than by counter arguments with facts. Among the comments from experts was that, quote, sex and sexuality have become far too complex and technical to leave to the typical parent who is either uninformed or too bashful to share useful sexual information with his child, end quote. The bashful part I get. Um, Complex and technical? You think a parent doesn't know anything about sex? I think they know at least enough how to on how to produce a child. If they're a parent and they don't know how babies are made, then there's other problems going on there. Across a broad spectrum of issues, people who see themselves as possessors of superior consequential knowledge lacking in other people see no problem in preempting other people's decisions, nor are consequences that are the opposite of what was predicted necessarily chastening. Many advocates of sex education in public schools used these dire consequences as showing an even more urgent need for additional sex education. However, as in the case of the early progressive era genetic determinists, there was one prominent supporter of sex education in the public schools who frankly faced the facts. This was Sargent Shriver, former head of the Office of Economic Opportunity, which had led the early charge for sex education in public schools. He said in testimony before a congressional committee in 1978, quote, just as venereal disease has skyrocketed 350% in the last 15 years when we have had more clinics, more pills, and more sex education than ever in history, teenage pregnancy has risen. End quote. As with Carl Brigham's recanting of his conclusions on genetic determinism in an earlier generation, it is hard to find others prepared to be equally frank. They think they might know the basics, but they probably don't know advanced stuff like anatomy. Yeah, that's true, but there's still the assumption that by the intellectuals that they know better, and I see where he's coming from on that. I've dealt with quite a few intellectuals that always seem to think they know better, even if it's a subject they know nothing about. They just assume they're more intelligent than you, therefore, or they have a degree, therefore, they just automatically are more informed. And anyway, I have a pretty poor opinion of a lot of intellectuals. Um, and that's coming from a college educated guy. So, anyway, patterns and consequences. In politics, whether electoral politics or ideological politics, the word crisis often means whatever situation someone wants to change. Far from automatically indicating some dire condition threatening the public, it often means simply a golden opportunity for surrogates to use the taxpayers' money and the government's power to advance the surrogates' interests, whether these interests are political, ideological, or financial. I think the important thing is what the degree is in and the individual. That is true. Um, to some extent. I mean, it's awfully easy to get a degree and come away with very little knowledge in that field. Um, college went downhill in the past few decades. Kids can't even read books anymore and are in Ivy League schools. Yeah, that's what was your degree in again? No, I have not sociology. I was this close to getting a sociology degree. No, I've got degrees in anthropology and psychology. And had I known a semester earlier, I could have taken like two sociology classes and gotten a triple major. But um, and it would have been even less. Uh, Psych attracts a lot of idiots. Yes, it does. It also attracts a lot of people that think they can fix themselves, or they think there's something wrong with them that needs to be fixed. Um, there's a lot of people in psychology that go into it for that. Hey, man, you calling me an idiot? No, there were a lot of idiots. A lot of idiots. There are a lot of idiots in anthropology, too. Where was I? Almost had a psych degree, was 9 credits away, plus a few gen ed credits. Switched to geography. All right, all right. You're not missing anything. I got out of the. I thought I was going to go through and get a PhD in psych, and then I got out and kind of dealt with some people that were doing jobs in kind of in the field where a psych degree um, would have been useful, and I saw the state of things, I'll say, and that completely turned me off of ever wanting to continue with psych. Um, and as it is, I ended up dropping out in my first semester of grad school. So there you go. Anyway, um, let's see. Did I read that whole? Oh no, I didn't. Intellectual elites crusading for their ideological goals have for centuries seen children as a special target for their messages. As far back as the 18th century, William Godwin said that children, other people's children, quote, are a sort of raw material put into our hands, end quote. Their minds are like a sheet of white paper. This vision of teaching other people's children as a golden opportunity for intellectuals to shape society by controlling what is inscribed on these children, on these young and presumably blank minds, I don't know where I got that, has remained a key feature of social crusades to remake the world to fit the preconceptions of intellectual elites who see themselves as key possessors of consequential knowledge. This same conception of the educational role of crusading intellectual elites was a central feature of the progressive era in both the early 20th century and the later 20th century. Continuing, man, I hate it when I start stumbling like that. Continuing on into our own times. Before progressive era icon Woodrow Wilson became president of the United States, he was president of Princeton University. He saw his role as an educator to be, quote, to make the young gentlemen of the rising generation as unlike their fathers as possible, end quote. There was no suggestion of who gave him such a mandate, or even whether parents would tolerate, much less pay for, such a usurpation of their role if they knew about it. Another major figure of the early progressive era, Professor John Dewey of Columbia University, likewise saw schools as places to help, quote, eliminate obvious social evils, end quote, through the school's development of children and youth, but also of the future society of which they will be the constituents. Schools train the state of tomorrow, according to Dewey, and could be instrumental in overcoming the present defects of our system, quote unquote. In short, he's got a lot of quotes here, sorry. In short, quote, it is the business of the school environment to eliminate so far as possible the unworthy features of the existing environment and be weeding out undesirable dead wood from the past, end quote. John Dewey has long been recognized as a major and lasting influence on the role of American public schools. Dewey's many writings on education seldom focused on such mundane concerns as how to get students to better understand mathematics, science, or language. He clearly sought a more expansive role for educators as promoters of a progressive vision of society, and doing so behind the backs of parents. When Dewey created the laboratory school at the University of Chicago, its goals were ideological, reflecting Dewey's own passionate. Sorry, I just saw a message flash up. Dewey's own passionate feelings about political issues of the time, and especially a sense of need to change the economic and other institutions of American society. We're getting there. We're 22 pages in out of the 30. Ironically, many intellectual elites then and now seem to regard themselves as promoting a more democratic society when they preempt other people's decisions. Their conception of democracy seems to be equalization of outcomes by intellectual elites. This would confer benefits on the less fortunate at the expense of those whom these surrogates consider less deserving. That is very different from democracy as a political system based on free choices by members of the voting public to determine what laws and policies they want to be governed by and which individuals they want to put in charge of the government to administer those laws and policies. No prominent American more openly declared his rejection of democracy as political control by the voting public than President Woodrow Wilson. He rejected popular sovereignty, quote unquote, as a basis for government because he saw it as an obstacle impeding what he called executive expertness. Clearly, he saw consequential knowledge concentrated in elite experts. He saw the many. Sorry, this is a broken quote. The people as selfish, ignorant, timid, stubborn, and foolish, end quote. He deplored what he called, quote, that besetting error of ours, the error of trying to do too much by vote, end quote. He favored government by surrogate decision makers armed with superior knowledge and understanding, executive expertness, and unhindered by the voting public. Yeah, seems like some people have been studying him. Woodrow Wilson's response to objections that this would deprive the people at large of the freedom to live their own lives as they saw fit was to redefine the word freedom. He used the phrase the new freedom when running for president in 1912 and publishing a book with that title by simply depicting government provided benefits dispensed by surrogate decision makers as an additional freedom for the recipients. President Wilson made the issue of people's loss of freedom disappear as if by verbal sleight of hand. Whether the supposed beneficiaries of these policies would consider a trade-off of personal freedom for government benefits worthwhile was a question kept off the agenda by this redefinition of the word freedom. Woodrow Wilson's book was subtitled A Call for the Emancipation of the Generous Energies of a People, and was dedicated with all my heart, quote unquote, to people who would go into unselfish public service. Rhetorically, at least, people were being emancipated rather than losing freedom. Similar themes would be echoed again and again over the years by others on into the 21st century. During the vast expansion of the American welfare state by the Lyndon Johnson administration in the 1960s, for example, a cabinet member in that administration used the redefinition of freedom as increases of the kind of things that governments could provide rather than as personal autonomy in one's own decisions and behavior. Quote, only when he can support himself and his family, choose his job, and make a living wage can an individual and his family exercise real freedom. Otherwise, he is a servant to survival without the means to do what he wants to do. End quote. Some years later, a book by two Yale professors, Politics, Economics, and Welfare, likewise defined freedom in terms of things received rather than autonomy preserved. As they expressed it, quote, "We shall try to unravel some of the complexities in the theory and practice of freedom," end quote. Their conception of freedom was the absence of obstacles to the realization of desires. The complexities of this Wilsonian definition of freedom are certainly understandable, since evading the obvious can become very complex. When Spartacus led an uprising of slaves back in the days of the Roman Empire, he was not doing it to get welfare state benefits. The more sophisticated or complex redefinition of freedom has continued on into the 21st century. The author of a book titled The Great Escape, Health, Wealth, and the Origins of Inequality said, quote, "In this book, when I speak of freedom, it is the freedom to live a good life and to do the things that make life worth living. The absence of freedom is poverty, deprivation, and poor health. Long the lot of such lo- long the lot of much of humanity, and still the fate of an outrageously high proportion of the world today." End quote. Back in the days of the early progressive movement at the beginning of the 20th century, John Dewey questioned whether most people even cared much about freedom in the sense the word meant for centuries before Woodrow Wilson redefined it. Dewey said, quote, "Does freedom in itself and in the things it brings with it seem as important as security of livelihood, as food, shelter, clothing, or even as having a good time?" End quote. Dewey asked, quote, "How does the desire for freedom compare in intensity with the desire to feel equal with others, especially with those who have previously been called superiors?" End quote. He said, quote, "As we look at the world, we see supposedly free institutions in many countries not so much overthrown as abandoned willingly, apparently with enthusiasm." End quote. Although Dewey was a professor of philosophy, well aware that theories, quote, "must be regarded as hypotheses," end quote, to be subjected to actions which test them, so that they are not to be accepted as rigid dogmas. No such tests or evidence accompanied his own sweeping pronouncements about such things as obvious social evils, quote unquote, in contemporary American society, nor were such tests applied to Professor Dewey's other sweeping pronouncements about, quote, "our defective industrial regime," end quote. His claim that industrial entrepreneurs have reaped out of all proportion to what they sowed, or that schools needed to offset the coarseness, blunders, and prejudices of their elders that children see at home. This casual contempt for ordinary people and their freedom was by no means confined to John Dewey or to educators. In the law as well, there has been the same disregard of other people's rights and values by intellectual elites. One of the leading legal authorities of the progressive era was Roscoe Pound, who was for 20 years, from 1916 to 1936, dean of the Harvard Law School, which turned out many leading legal scholars promoting an expansive role for judges in interpreting the Constitution to come on to loosen its restrictions on government power in the cause of what Roscoe Pound called social justice as far back as 1907. Pound invoked the words science and scientific repeatedly in his discussions, which had neither the procedures nor the precision of science. There was to be a science of politics and a science of law. Similarly, Pound repeatedly called for social engineering, as if other human beings were to be like inert components of social machinery to be constructed by elites into a society with social justice, quote unquote. With Pound, as with Woodrow Wilson, what the public at large wanted faded into the background. Pound lamented that, quote, "we still harp upon the sacredness of property before the law," end quote, and approvingly cited the progress of law away from the older individualism, which is not confined to property rights. And those were two short quotes again. Thus, in 1907 and 1908, Roscoe Pound set forth principles of judicial activism, going beyond interpreting the law to make social policy. That would still be dominant more than 100 years later and on into the present. One of the rationales for such an expanded role for judges has been the claim that the Constitution is too hard to amend, so that judges must amend it by interpretation to adapt it to changing times. Like so much that has been said and repeated endlessly by elites and the social justice vision, this rationale is contradicted by readily available facts. The Constitution of the United States was amended 4 times in 8 years, from 1913 through 1920, during the heyday of the progressives, who claimed that it was nearly impossible to amend the Constitution. When the people wanted the Constitution amended, it was amended. When the elites wanted it amended, but the people did not, that was not a problem to be solved. That was democracy, even if it frustrated elites convinced that their superior wisdom and virtue should be imposed on others. Dean Pound simply dismissed as dogma the Constitution's separation of powers because the separation of powers would, quote, limit the court to interpretation and application of the law, end quote. Pound's own conception of the role of judges was far more expansive. As far back as 1908, Pound referred to the desirability of, quote, a living constitution by judicial interpretation, end quote. He called for an awakening of juristic activities for the sociological jurist, and declared that law must be judged by the results it achieves. What he called mechanical jurisprudence was condemned for its failure to respond to vital needs of present-day life. When law becomes a body of rules, that is the condition against which sociologists now protest, and protest rightly. Again, quote unquote. He said, why judges and sociologists should be making social policy instead of people elected as legislators or executives was not explained. Whether in law or in other areas, one of the hallmarks of elite intellectuals seeking to preempt other people's decisions, whether on public policy or in their own private lives, is a reliance on unsubstantiated pronouncements based on elite consensus, treated as if that was equivalent to documented facts. One revealing sign of this is how often the arguments of people with other views are not answered with counter-arguments, but are ad hominem assertions, instead. This pattern has persisted for more than a century, not only in discussions of social justice issues, but also in other issues, and not only in the United States, but also among other intellectual elites in countries on the other side of the Atlantic. From the earliest days of the progressive era in the United States, one of the features of progressives' conceptions of advanced social thinking was that automatic punishment of criminals should be replaced, or at least supplemented by treatment of the criminal, as if crime were a disease, and a disease whose root causes could be traced to society as well as to the criminal. Such ideas can be traced back at least as far as such 18th century writers as William Godwin in England and the Marquis de Condorcet in France. But these ideas were often presented by 20th century progressives as new revelations of modern social science and were widely celebrated among intellectual elites. In this atmosphere, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a series of early 1960s cases, began to interpret the Constitution as providing newly discovered rights for criminals that had apparently escaped notice before. These cases included Mapp v. Ohio, 1961, Escobedo versus Illinois, 1964, and Miranda versus Arizona, 1966. The Supreme Court majority, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, were undeterred by bitter dissenting opinions from other justices who objected to both the dangers being created and the lack of legal basis for the decisions. At a 1965 conference of judges and legal scholars, when a former police commissioner complained about the trend of recent Supreme Court decisions on criminal law, Justice William J. Brennan and Chief Justice Earl Warren sat stony-faced during his presentation, according to a New York Times account. But after a law professor responded with scorn and ridicule to what the commissioner said, Warren and Brennan frequently roared with laughter, quote unquote. A mere police official opposing learned Olympians of the law may have seemed humorous to elites at this gathering, but some crime statistics might present a somewhat different perspective. Prior to the Supreme Court's remaking of the criminal law beginning in the early 1960s, the homicide rate in the United States had been going down for 3 consecutive decades, and that rate in proportion to population was in 1960 just under half of what it had been in 1934. But almost immediately after the Supreme Court's creation of sweeping new rights for criminals, the homicide rate reversed. It doubled from 1963 to 1973. No one found that humorous, least of all the mothers, widows, and orphans of homicide victims. Although this was a nationwide trend, it was especially severe in black communities, places supposedly being helped by social justice advocates, who were often also advocates of a de-emphasis of law enforcement and punishment, seeking instead to treat the root causes of crime. Both before and after the 1960s sudden upsurge in homicides, the homicide rate among blacks was consistently some multiple of the homicide rate among whites. In some years, there were more black homicide victims than white homicide victims in absolute numbers, even though the size of the black population was only a fraction of the size of the white population. This meant that the sudden upsurge in homicides took an especially heavy toll in black communities. Yeah, the soft on crime shit doesn't work for some people. Yeah, some people can have every opportunity and still choose to victimize others. Oh, absolutely. And when you do this whole catch and release stuff, and the same people are getting caught, arrested, and then released again, and before they've ever even been tried for the original crime, they've already committed a dozen more. It's, you got to change your ways on how you're dealing with them. That stuff just doesn't work. Um, Supreme Court justices with lifetime tenure are classic examples of elites who institutionally pay no price for being wrong, no matter how wrong and no matter how high the price paid by others. Chief Justice Earl Warren did not even pay the price of admitting a mistake. In his memoirs, he rejected critics of the Supreme Court's criminal law decisions. He blamed crime, quote, in our disturbed society on the root causes of crime, end quote, citing such examples as poverty, unemployment, and the degradation of slum life. But he offered no factual evidence that any of these things had suddenly gotten worse in the 1960s than they had been in the 3 preceding decades when the homicide rate was going down. Implications, and we're almost done. We actually have barely over a page left. How we see the distribution of consequential knowledge is crucial for deciding what kinds of decisions make sense through what kinds of policies and institutions. We each have our own island of knowledge in a sea of ignorance. Some islands are larger than others, but no island is as large as the sea. As Hayek conceived it, the enormously vast amount of consequential knowledge dispersed among the population of a whole society makes the difference in the amount of such knowledge between some people and other people comparatively insignificant, quote unquote. This conclusion provides little basis for intellectual elites to engage in wholesale preemption of other people's decisions, whether these are decisions about how they live their own lives or decisions about the kinds of laws that voting public want to live under and the people they want in charge of carrying out those laws. Intellectual elites with outstanding achievements within their own respective specialties may give little thought to how ignorant they may be on a vast spectrum of other concerns. Even more dangerous than ignorance, however, is a fallacious certitude which can afflict people at all educational levels and all IQ levels. While we may not see our own fallacies, the saving grace in this situation is that we can often see other people's fallacies much more clearly, and they can see ours. In a world of inevitably fallible human beings with inevitably different viewpoints and different fragments of consequential knowledge, our ability to correct each other can be essential to preventing our making fatally dangerous mistakes as individuals or as a society. The fatal danger of our times today is a growing intolerance and suppression of both opinions and evidence that differ from the prevailing ideologies that dominate institutions, ranging from the academic world to the corporate world, the media, and government institutions. Many intellectuals with high accomplishments seem to assume that those accomplishments confer validity to their notions about a broad swath of issues ranging far beyond the scope of their accomplishments. But stepping outside the scope of one's expertise can be like stepping off a cliff. Yeah, you got to prevent crime and punish crime. Too many people just want one extreme. Yeah, exactly. And they're paying the price for it. Um, you look at some of these areas where they're complaining that Walgreens is shutting down and Walmarts are shutting and Targets are closing down. Well, you voted for it is the unfortunate answer, that if you're voting for people that are putting in policies that say, well, we're not going to punish anybody or even charge anybody that steals less than $950 worth of stuff, you're just encouraging people to go in and steal just shy of $950 worth of stuff as often as they possibly can. It just, there are too many people that want something for nothing. And if you give them that opportunity, they're going to take it. Okay, last two paragraphs. Socrates said something like that. All the experts in Athens had an inflated sense of their own wisdom on matters, but Socrates knew the limits of his own knowledge. Yes, exactly. Um, that's another thing I need to add into this stream is I need to start reading some philosophy too. I've downloaded a lot of it, and I think I will start doing that because I have read bits and pieces over the years, but um, never to any great extent. And I only ever took one philosophy class in school, and the teacher sucked. He just automatically assumed you were an expert on all things philosophy before you even walked into this intro to philosophy class. So, yeah. 5 dialogues. Yeah. Start with Plato. The dialogues. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, that's not the next thing I'm going to read, but it will be added to the list for sure. Then the Republic. Yeah. Yeah. Those are the ones that I had in mind. Okay, last two paragraphs. A high IQ and low information can be a very dangerous combination as a basis for preempting other people's decisions, especially when this preemption takes place in circumstances where there is no price for surrogate decision makers to pay for being wrong. Stupid people can create problems, but it often takes brilliant people to create a real catastrophe. They have already done that enough times and in enough different ways for us to consider before joining their latest stampedes led by self-congratulatory elites deaf to argument and immune to evidence. And that is the end of that chapter. That's a good line. Deaf to argument and immune to evidence. Might have to write that one down. All right, so then the last chapter, which I will not start tonight because my voice is about done, um, is going to be another 30 pages, and then we're done because the last third of the page of the book, like I said, is all just his citations. High IQ, low information people are fools usually. They are Ferrari engines running off Illegal black market gasoline. That's a good way to put it. All right. I have had enough of that reading stuff for the night. I'm ready to play a game. But I'm going to raid somebody. Who do I want to raid? You know who I haven't raided in a very long time is actually Zeus. Zeuswood. When am I reading more of it? I will be finishing that last chapter on Tuesday. And then I'll start a new book next Friday. And I am still trying to narrow that down. I'm thinking the next one is going to be on secret societies. I have a couple of books that briefly cover a bunch of different secret societies, like, Skull and Bones and, things like that. And I thought that would be an interesting change of pace. So that's what I'll do next. So, all right. I'm going to take us on over to Zeus. So if you want to stick around a minute or two, I will see you over there. All right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've already suggested what I should start with, and I will. Five dialogues and then the Republic. So um, that will be what I start with. But then I'll get your recommendation after that. So I think that's what I'll do is I'll do the Secret Societies book, and then I'll do Plato. So thank you for those suggestions, and I'll be hitting you up for more suggestions. So, all right, here we go. We're going to go on over to Zeus. I'll see you over there in just a minute.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into the